Clara Whitcomb didn't hesitate. When she found the wounded mare in the fog, bleeding, trembling, wearing a saddle worth more than her family's entire farm, she didn't think about selling it. She thought, someone is suffering. She brought that horse home with her bare hands, not knowing it would change everything. Not knowing the man who owned it had spent 15 years searching for her father. And not knowing that before sunset, he would be standing at her gate with a secret her family had buried before she was old enough to understand why. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel, follow every part to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1814 came to the James River Valley like a slow fever, thick, breathless, and full of things that wouldn't stay buried. Clara Whitcomb had been awake since before the birds. She moved through the marsh road in the gray hour before sunrise, the way she always did when her mind wouldn't settle deliberately quietly, her basket over one arm and her boots already wet from the dew on the high grass. She wasn't out there for peace. She was out there because her mother needed the marshwort and the pale yarrow that only grew in the wet ground near the river bend, and because gathering herbs was the one thing she could do before breakfast that felt like it mattered. The family was close to losing the farm. She knew it the way she knew weather in her bones before anyone said a word. Her father Elias had stopped eating much at supper. Her mother Ruth had started mending the same dress twice. And 2 nights ago, Clara had heard them in the kitchen after she was supposed to be asleep, not arguing, just talking in that low, careful way people talk when they are trying not to frighten each other. The creditor was coming by the end of the month. Clara pressed that thought flat against the bottom of her mind and kept walking. She was maybe a quarter mile from the river bend when she heard it. Not a sound she could name right away. Something between a breath and a moan, broken animal wrong. She stopped cold on the road and listened. It came again. She moved toward it without deciding to. The fog was thick enough that she couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction, and she pushed through it with one hand out in front of her, following the sound by instinct. Her boot caught a root. She caught herself on a fence post and kept going. The mare came out of the mist like a ghost, gray as river smoke, standing at the edge of the tree line with one foreleg lifted and blood dark on her coat from the knee down. She was shaking not from cold, but from fear, the kind of shaking that gets into a horse's chest and doesn't let go. Her saddle was still on, and it was the finest piece of leather Clara had ever seen in her life, stitched, polished. The stirrups were silver, and even in the poor gray light Clara could see there was a crest worked into the metal. She didn't move for a moment. She just looked. And then she exhaled slow and deliberate and said low and even the way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old. "Easy now, girl, easy. I ain't gonna hurt you." The mare's ears swiveled toward her voice. "That's right." Clara took one step, then another. Her basket went down in the grass beside her. "You been out here all night, haven't you? Standing in the wet. That leg's gotta be screaming at you something fierce." The mare shuddered but didn't bolt. Clara kept talking, not words that meant anything, just the steady sound of a calm human voice, and she kept moving one slow step at a time until she was close enough to put her hand against the mare's neck. The horse pressed into her palm. Clara closed her eyes for just a second. Don't think about selling the saddle. Don't think about what those silver stirrups are worth. Don't think about the creditor or the farm or the $27 you don't have. She opened her eyes and looked at the crest on the stirrup. She had seen it before. Once. On a gate pillar years ago, when she was maybe 12, and her father had taken her on an errand toward the northern county. She had asked him whose gate that was. He had gone very quiet. Then he had said, "That's no place we'll ever visit," and he'd looked forward and not spoken again for half the ride home. Clara picked up her basket. She gathered the mare's reins in her free hand, stroked the gray neck once more, and turned toward home. Someone is looking for you, she thought. And when they find out where you've been, they're going to come to wherever you are. That thought sat heavy in her chest, the whole walk back. Her father was standing in the yard when she came through the gate, already dressed. Already worried, because that was Elias Whitcomb's natural state these days, dressed and worried before the sun was fully up. He was a lean man, who had once been straight-backed and particular about his collar. But 2 years of slow financial disaster had taken some of that out of him. He still had the careful eyes, though. Still had the habit of watching the road like he expected bad news to come riding in any minute. He saw the mare before he saw Clara's face. The color went out of him so fast that Clara actually stepped forward thinking he might fall. "Pa, where did you find her?" It wasn't a question. His voice had gone flat in a way she didn't recognize. "Marsh Road, near the river bend. She was bleeding. I think she stepped in a hole or caught her leg on something in the dark." Clara kept her voice steady. "She's not too bad off. I can clean the wound and wrap it. But Pa, whose horse is this?" Elias didn't answer right away. He walked toward the mare slowly, and he looked at the saddle and then at the crest on the stirrup, and his jaw tightened up like he was clenching something inside it. "Pa." Clara stepped around to face him. "Tell me." "Ashford," he said, and the word came out like he was putting a stone down. "Ashford Ridge." Yes. She had heard of it, of course. Everybody in the county had heard of Ashford Ridge. The Ashford family had more land than most small towns. The current master of the estate, she'd heard his name once or twice. Nathaniel Ashford, former militia officer, returned from service 2 years prior. Rich, reserved. The kind of man people talked about without knowing him, which was its own kind of power. "What do you know about them?" Clara asked quietly. Elias looked at her, and something moved across his face. Grief or anger, she couldn't quite tell the difference anymore. "More than I want to," he said. "Take the horse back, Clara. Ride her up to Ashford Ridge. Tell them you found her on the Marsh Road. Speak to a servant. Don't wait for thanks, and don't explain yourself, and don't—" He stopped. "Don't tell them your name." Clara frowned. "Why not?" "Because I said so." "Pa." "Clara." His voice cracked just slightly on her name. "Please, just do this one thing the way I'm asking." She studied her father for a long moment, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands were braced against his sides, like he was holding something in by force. Then she looked at her mother, who had appeared in the doorway with a dishcloth in her hands, and was looking at Elias with an expression Clara recognized as deep, private fear. Something was here that she didn't understand yet. "All right," she said finally. "I'll take her back." She went to saddle their mule. Her brother Sam, 14 and entirely unable to mind his own business, materialized from behind the barn with straw in his hair. "Is that an Ashford horse?" he said, eyes gone wide. "Go back to your chores, Sam." "The crest on the stirrup, Clara, that's worth more than—" "Samuel." She looked at him steadily. "Chores." He slunk off, but she caught him looking back twice. She didn't ride the mule. She led the mare and walked alongside her, keeping the pace easy, so the injured leg didn't take too much weight. It was 3 miles to Ashford Ridge by the main road, and she did it without hurrying, talking to the horse the whole way. "You've got a name I expect," she said. "Something fine. Something that sounds like what you look like." She glanced at the mare's gray coat gone soft silver, now that the fog was lifting and the morning sun was coming through. "Silver something." The mare's ear tilted toward her voice. "Silver Bell," Clara said. "That's what I'd call you." The gates of Ashford Ridge were open, which surprised her. A farmhand was coming down the drive at nearly a jog when he saw her, and then he stopped, and then he shouted something back toward the house, and suddenly there were 3 of them. 2 farmhands and a woman who looked like a senior housekeeper, all moving fast and talking at once. "Lord above, that's Silver Bell." "Where did you find her, miss?" "Is she hurt? Let me see." Clara stepped back and let them take the reins, and she answered their questions plainly. Marsh Road near the river bend foreleg wound that needed cleaning, probably tripped in a hole in the dark. "She's been out since yesterday evening," the housekeeper said, crouching to look at the leg, her voice tight with something between relief and distress. "Mr. Ashford was—" She stopped herself. Clara waited. "He'll want to know who brought her in," the woman said, straightening and looking at Clara properly for the first time. "Who are you, Miss—" Clara thought of her father's voice. "Don't tell them your name." She thought of the look on her mother's face in the doorway. "I'm nobody in particular," she said. "I found the horse and I brought her home. That's all there is to it." She turned to go. She had made it maybe 20 feet back down the drive when she heard footsteps. Not the quick shuffle of a servant, but the deliberate, even stride of someone who walked like he owned the ground under his boots, because he did. She didn't turn around. "Miss." She kept walking. "Miss?" The voice was closer now, and it had an edge of command in it, not cruel, just accustomed to being heard on the first try. Clara stopped. She turned around slowly. He was standing in the middle of his own drive, looking at her, and looking at Silverbell, and the expression on his face was the kind that people make when something that mattered more than they expected it to has just come back to them. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a plain work shirt rolled at the sleeves, which surprised her. She had expected fine clothes. He looked like a man who'd been up all night. "You brought her in," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at the mare, really looked the way you look at something you were afraid you'd lost, and then he looked back at Clara. "Where did you find her?" "Marsh Road, south of the river bend. She was bleeding from the foreleg. I think she caught it on something in the dark." He nodded once slowly like he was filing that away. Then, "You walked her 3 miles." "Yes, sir." "You could have left her." "I reckon I could have," Clara said simply. "But I didn't." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like he was recalibrating something. He took a step forward, and for a moment she thought he was going to offer money, and she already knew what she was going to say to that, but instead he said, "I'd like to know your name." Clara looked at him. This man whose family had done something to hers, though she didn't know what exactly. Only that her father had gone white as paper at the sight of that crest. And she thought, there is a version of this moment where I tell him, and there is a version where I don't. And I don't yet know which one my father needs me to choose. "No need, sir," she said. "The horse is home safe. That's the end of it." She turned back down the drive. He didn't call after her again, but she felt his eyes on her back all the way to the gate. She was in the kitchen helping her mother with supper when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Sam heard them too. She saw his head come up the same way hers did, and then the hoofbeats slowed and stopped outside their gate. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. A dark horse. A rider in a plain coat, sitting still in the saddle, looking at the gate like he was deciding something. "Who is that?" her mother said softly, coming to stand beside her. "I don't know," Clara said. But she felt something cold walk up the back of her neck because she did know. She recognized the way he sat on a horse, straight, deliberate, like a man who'd learned to ride in the militia. Nathaniel Ashford stepped down from his horse, walked to their gate, and knocked. Elias appeared in the doorway of the front room so fast that Clara realized he'd been listening for that knock, that on some level, he'd been listening for it for years. Father and daughter looked at each other. "Pa," she said quietly. "I know," he said. He straightened his collar. He walked to the front door with his shoulders back, and Clara followed 2 steps behind, and Ruth took Sam by the arm and stayed in the kitchen doorway like she was bracing for weather. Elias opened the front door. Nathaniel Ashford stood on the other side of it, hat in hand, looking at Elias Whitcomb, the way a man looks at something he owes a debt to, direct and unashamed of it, and weighted down with 15 years of carrying it alone. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said. Elias's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mr. Ashford." A silence stretched between them long enough that Clara counted 6 heartbeats. Then Nathaniel said, "I have spent 15 years looking for the man my father ruined." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her father didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes had gone bright with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. Something older than both, something that had been waiting a very long time to be named. "I believe," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady and low, "that I have found him." Clara looked at her father, at this man who had ordered her not to give her name, who had gone pale at the sight of a silver crest in the fog, who had been quiet for weeks, and mending the same silences over and over like her mother mended that dress. And she understood for the first time that the fog this morning had not simply given her a wounded horse, it had given her the beginning of the truth. And the truth, it turned out, had been standing at their gate the whole time. Elias Whitcomb stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in," he said. Elias Whitcomb's kitchen was not built for men like Nathaniel Ashford, not because it was too small, and not because it was too plain, though it was both those things, but because the air inside it had always carried the particular weight of a family that had learned to survive on very little pride and even less luck. And Nathaniel Ashford, standing just inside the doorway with his hat in both hands, looked like a man who understood that and was ashamed of his part in it. Nobody sat down right away. Ruth stayed near the hearth with Sam pressed against her side. Clara stood behind her father with her arms at her sides and her jaw set because she had learned a long time ago that when you don't know what's coming, you stand still and you watch. Elias finally pulled out a chair and lowered himself into it like a man setting down something very heavy. He gestured to the chair across the table. Nathaniel sat. "Say what you came to say," Elias said. Nathaniel set his hat on the table between them, and he looked at it for a moment like he was gathering something up from inside himself. Then he looked at Elias directly. "My father's name was Charles Ashford," he said. "In the spring of 1799, he accused you of stealing $40 from the estate accounts. You were the head clerk at the time. You had worked for him for 6 years without a single complaint against your name." Elias didn't move, didn't blink. "You were dismissed without a hearing," Nathaniel continued. "You lost your position, your reference, your standing in this county. And my father knew when he made that accusation that it was false." The sound Ruth made was barely audible, just a small broken exhale, but Clara heard it like a crack in glass. "How do you know that?" Elias said. His voice was perfectly controlled, which Clara recognized as the most dangerous kind of calm. Nathaniel reached inside his coat and placed a folded document on the table. "Because I found his private ledger," he said. "The one he kept separate from the estate books. The $40 was never missing. He moved it himself to settle a gambling debt he didn't want my mother to know about. He needed someone to blame. You were convenient." Elias looked at the document. He didn't touch it. "Convenient," he repeated. "Yes, sir. I lost 15 years. Elias's voice didn't rise. If anything, it dropped lower. "I lost my name. My children grew up without the life they should have had. My wife—" He stopped. He pressed his mouth flat and looked at the wall. "You come in here with a piece of paper." "I know it's not enough," Nathaniel said quietly. "No," Elias said. "It's not." Clara put her hand on her father's shoulder without thinking. She felt him tense, and then very slowly release like a fist unclenching. "Then what are you offering?" she said, because Elias wasn't going to ask and someone needed to. Nathaniel looked at her, and she saw something in his expression shift when he did a recognition, like he was only now fully placing her. "Your daughter," he said, not to her, but back to Elias. "She found Silverbell this morning." "She did," Elias said. "She brought her 3 miles on foot and refused to give her name." He paused. "That kind of character doesn't grow in poor ground, Mr. Whitcomb. It grows in a household where someone raises children right." Elias said nothing. "I am offering restitution," Nathaniel said. "Not charity. I want to be clear about the difference. What my father took from you had a cost, and I intend to account for it." Elias pushed back from the table. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. "I won't take your money," he said. "Pa," Clara started. "I won't." His voice was final. "I spent 15 years being the man your father said I was in the eyes of this county. I am not going to spend the next 15 being the man who took your guilt money and called it square." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear Sam breathing behind her. Nathaniel didn't argue. He didn't push. He just sat there looking at Elias's back with an expression that Clara would have called respect if she'd trusted herself to read him right. Then let me offer something else, Nathaniel said finally. Elias turned. My sister Lydia is 17 years old. She hasn't left the estate in 8 months, not since our mother died. She's sharp and she's restless and she's lonely in the particular way that girls get lonely when the world decides they ought to be decorative and silent. He paused. She needs a companion who will treat her like a person with a mind. Not a paid attendant, not a charity case, a genuine companion for the summer. He looked at Clara. I would ask Miss Whitcomb if she is willing to come to Ashford Ridge for the season. Her own room, her own time. No obligations beyond being present and honest with my sister. Clara felt every eye in the room move to her face. She looked at her father. Elias was looking back at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between warning and permission, like he was trying to tell her two things at once and couldn't choose between them. She looked at Nathaniel. Why? She said. You don't know me. No, he agreed. But I know what you did this morning, and I know what you didn't do, which matters more. He held her gaze. You didn't take anything that wasn't yours. Clara felt something steady itself inside her chest. I'll think on it, she said. She said yes 3 days later, not because she trusted him, because she needed to understand what her father had buried, and the answer was at Ashford Ridge. She felt it the way you feel a splinter under the skin, not always painful, but always there, always wrong, and you cannot stop pressing at it until it comes out. Elias didn't try to talk her out of it. He just pulled her close in the yard the morning she left and held on a little longer than usual, and when he let go, he cupped the back of her head like she was still small enough to fit in his palm, and he said, You be careful with what you hear up there, Clara. What do you mean? He shook his head. I mean what I said. Be careful. Be. She wanted to ask more. But Ruth was standing at the gate holding Sam back by the collar, and the hired wagon was already waiting, and some questions have to wait for the moment that's ready to hold them. Ashford Ridge was everything the name promised, and nothing that prepared you for being inside it. Clara didn't let herself be impressed. She kept her face neutral and her spine straight, and she answered every question the housekeeper asked her with plain, direct language, and when Lydia Ashford came barreling down the main staircase with her hair half-pinned and her boots unlaced and a book tucked under one arm, Clara felt something loosen in her chest for the first time since she'd arrived. You're Clara Whitcomb, Lydia said, stopping 3 steps from the bottom and looking her over with frank, open curiosity. Nathaniel said you walked Silverbell 3 miles and wouldn't take a cent for it. That's right, Clara said. Why? Because it wasn't my horse. Lydia stared at her for a moment. Then she burst out laughing. Not polite laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes up before you can stop it, and said, Oh, I am going to like you enormously. Clara almost smiled. We'll see. Lydia grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the east corridor before the housekeeper could offer to show her upstairs, talking the entire way about which rooms had the best light and which of the servants were worth knowing, and what on earth Clara had done to get her brother to actually take a social initiative for the first time in 3 years. He came to your house, Lydia said, dropping her voice like it was a state secret. Nathaniel went to someone's house, of his own accord. Do you understand how unusual that is? I expect he felt he owed something, Clara said. He did, Lydia said, and the brightness in her voice went quieter for just a moment. He always feels he owes something. That's the thing about him. He carries all of it. Clara filed that away, said nothing. She met Aunt Beatrice at supper. Beatrice Ashford was a woman built like a courthouse, solid, symmetrical, and not especially warm to those who entered without proper cause. She sat at the far end of the supper table and looked at Clara across it the way you look at a piece of furniture you haven't decided whether to keep. You returned the horse, she said. Yes, ma'am. Without being asked, without leaving your name. Yes, ma'am. Beatrice cut her food with precision. What did you expect to happen? Nothing, Clara said. I didn't do it to cause something to happen. Everyone does things to cause something to happen, Miss Whitcomb, even people who believe otherwise. Clara set down her fork. She looked at Beatrice steadily. "If you've already decided what you think of me, ma'am, there's not much I can say that'll change it. Defending myself to someone who's made up their mind only makes me look practiced at it." The table went quiet. Lydia's eyes were wide. Nathaniel, seated to Clara's left, was looking at her with an expression that was carefully neutral, but wasn't quite nothing. Beatrice looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she picked up her wineglass and said, "Pass the bread." And the supper moved on, and Clara never did figure out if she had passed some test or simply survived a warning. Probably both. Heck, she settled into the rhythm of the place the way water settles into new ground, slowly finding the low points, making herself useful without making herself invisible. She spent mornings with Lydia, who turned out to be exactly as bright and starved for honest conversation as Nathaniel had said. They read together, argued about books, walked the East Gardens, and by the end of the first week, Lydia had started bringing her own drafts of letters she was too proud to send, and asking Clara to read them without laughing. Clara read them without laughing. She always gave an honest answer. "You're the only person in this house who tells me when I'm wrong," Lydia said one afternoon, stretched across a settee with her book face down on her chest. "That can't be right," Clara said. "Nathaniel does sometimes, but he's careful about it. You're not careful at all." "I don't mean to be unkind. You're not." Lydia tilted her head. "It's different. You say it like you assume I can handle the truth and nobody else around here does that. Everyone treats me like I'm made of paper." She paused. "It's exhausting being treated like you might tear." Clara looked at her. "You're not going to tear," she said simply. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "I know, but it's nice to hear someone else say it." Among the servants, Clara moved differently than the household guests usually did. She learned their names in the first 3 days, every one of them down to the youngest stable boy, and she used them, and she thanked them, and she didn't ask for things to be done twice when she could do them herself. By the end of the second week, the head groom had started briefing her on Silver Bell's recovery without being asked, because he'd noticed she went to the stable every morning to check the leg herself. The mare was healing well. Clara wrapped the leg fresh each day with a cloth soaked in the yarrow tincture she'd made from her mother's recipe, talking to the horse the whole time in the low, easy voice that she'd always found worked better than silence. She didn't notice the first few times that Nathaniel was watching her from the stable doorway. She noticed the third time. She didn't stop what she was doing. She just said, without turning around, "She's putting weight on it. Another week and she'll be close to right." He stepped into the stable and came to stand beside her. He looked at the leg. "That's a yarrow wrap," he said. "My mother's remedy. It works. Better than the one your groom was using." She glanced at him. "Don't tell him I said that." The corner of his mouth moved. "I won't." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached out and ran his hand along Silver Bell's neck in that particular way he had the grief-stricken tenderness she'd seen at a distance on the day she'd brought the mare home. Up close, it was quieter than she'd expected, more personal. "She was my mother's horse," he said. Clara straightened slowly. "I didn't know that. Most people don't." He looked at the mare. "She died 14 months ago. Silver Bell was the last thing she loved that was still here." He paused. "When she went missing, He stopped. "I don't make a habit of explaining myself." "You don't have to," Clara said. He looked at her, then really looked the way he had on the day she'd walked away from his drive, and she held his gaze without flinching, and without performing anything. Just looked back plainly the way she'd always done with things that mattered. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "when we're not in company, when it's just the stable and the horse and nobody watching, I'd prefer you call me Nathaniel." Clara considered that for a moment. "All right," she said. "Nathaniel." He nodded once, like something had been decided. He didn't make a speech about it. She liked that more than she expected to. She found the letter on a Tuesday evening. She'd written home 3 times since arriving, and had received 2 letters in return, one from her mother, cheerful and careful, and one from Sam, barely legible, and full of questions about the horses. But this one had arrived tucked inside her mother's second letter, sealed separately, with her name on the front in her father's handwriting. For Clara. Open when you are ready. She'd been carrying it for 5 days without opening it. She didn't know why. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was simpler and harder than that. She was afraid of what it said, and fear had kept her from it. She opened it, sitting on the edge of her bed, with the candle low, and the house gone quiet around her. It wasn't long. Her father's handwriting was careful, and even the way it always was when he wrote something that cost him. He wrote that her mother's name before marriage had not been Ruth Larson, as Clara had always been told. Her mother had been born Ruth Ashford, the daughter of a younger brother of the Ashford line, unacknowledged, undocumented, cut off from the family before her own birth, because her grandfather had married without permission, and the family had refused to recognize the match. Her mother had grown up as no one. The Ashfords had made her invisible, and Elias, when he had worked at the estate, when he had known what he knew, had said nothing. He had loved Ruth and married her and buried her history with her permission, because she had asked him to, because she wanted nothing from the family that had made her nothing. But he had written it down in case Clara ever needed to know it. You are not simply a poor girl, her father had written at the bottom. You are part of a history they buried. I do not know what use that is to you now, but you deserve to know what you are made of. Clara sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She thought about Nathaniel, about the way he'd said your father's name with that particular weight, about the ledger evidence, about all those years of guilt that had driven him to a poor farmhouse in the middle of summer, to knock on a door and try to begin making something right. She thought about what he would say if she told him, and then she thought about what it would mean if she did, the complications, the questions, the way it might change everything. She was trying to build here on her own terms, on nothing but her own honesty and her own 2 hands. She folded the letter. She pressed it flat against her knee. She was not going to tell him. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Because she had come here to earn whatever she earned, and she was not going to let the accident of blood do the work that she intended to do herself. But the letter in her hands felt like a slow-burning fuse, and she understood, sitting there in the quiet, that silence, even the silence of good intentions, had its own kind of danger. She pressed it under her Bible on the nightstand and blew out the candle. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe around her, and she thought, everything is about to become more complicated, and I have just made it more so. She was right. She just didn't know yet exactly how. The county assembly was Caroline Mercer's idea of a battlefield, and she dressed accordingly. Clara knew who she was before anyone introduced them. You could tell by the way the room adjusted when Caroline walked in, the way conversations tilted slightly, the way certain women smiled with their mouths and not their eyes, the way men straightened without knowing they were doing it. Caroline Mercer was 23, beautiful in the particular way that requires maintenance and an audience, and she had been understood by every family in the county to be the inevitable future of Ashford Ridge for the better part of 4 years. Nobody had told Nathaniel that, apparently, or if they had, he hadn't agreed. Clara was standing near the far wall with Lydia when Nathaniel appeared at her elbow and said quietly and without preamble, "Will you dance the next set with me?" Lydia sucked in a breath so sharp that Clara nearly looked at her. Instead, she looked at Nathaniel. "You don't have to do that," she said, just as quietly. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking." She studied his face for a moment. He was steady, serious, not performing anything. "All right," she said. She felt the room notice before she'd taken 3 steps onto the floor. That particular quality of attention, the kind that moves through a crowd like a current person to person without a word being spoken, settled over the assembly the moment Nathaniel Ashford placed his hand at Clara Whitcomb's back. She kept her chin level and her shoulders down, and she danced the way she did everything, clean and deliberate, and without apology. Nathaniel was a good dancer. She hadn't expected that. He moved like a man who'd learned it under obligation and discovered he didn't mind it. And for the length of that set, the rest of the room seemed to fall back just slightly, and Clara forgot for 3 or 4 minutes that she was supposed to be worried about any of this. Then the set ended, and Caroline Mercer was there. She materialized at Clara's left with 2 other women in her wake, and a smile that had been constructed very carefully to look warm. "Miss Whitcomb," she said. "What a lovely surprise. I hadn't realized Nathaniel had taken on summer staff this year." The 2 women behind her made soft sounds that weren't quite laughter. Clara felt the hit land. She let it land. She did not move. "I'm a guest of Miss Ashford," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "Not staff." "Of course," Caroline said with a graciousness that managed to imply the opposite. How charming. A marsh girl playing at drawing rooms for the summer. She tilted her head slightly. "Do tell me, do you find it difficult moving between such very different worlds? I imagine it must be quite disorienting." "Not particularly," Clara said. "People are mostly the same wherever you find them. The only thing that changes is whether they bother being honest about who they are." Something flickered in Caroline's expression, not wounded exactly, but recalculated. "How refreshing," she said. "Such directness. I suppose that's what comes of growing up without the usual." She gestured a small, elegant motion, constraints. "Caroline." Nathaniel's voice came from just behind Clara's right shoulder, and it was the kind of quiet that carries more weight than volume. "I believe your mother is looking for you." It was a dismissal, and they both knew it. Caroline held his gaze for 1 beat too long, and then she smiled at him, not at Clara, and said, "Of course. Lovely to meet you, Miss Whitcomb," and turned and walked away with her 2 companions in formation behind her. The moment she was gone, Clara exhaled. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Nathaniel said exactly as he'd said it before. "I'm starting to understand that about you. You always think people are doing you favors when they're just doing what's right." Clara turned to look at him. "I let them treat you as temporary," he said low enough that only she could hear it. "I brought you here, and I left you to manage this county's opinions on your own, because I thought you were strong enough to handle it. That wasn't fair, and I want you to know I understand that now." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that. I mean it. I know you do. That's why I said thank you." Something shifted in his expression, the particular quality of a man who is used to having his sincerity questioned and is not certain what to do when it isn't. She told him about the letter the following morning. She hadn't planned to do it then. She had plans, careful ones, built over 3 weeks of turning the decision over in her mind the way you turn a stone, looking for the underside. But she woke up and she thought about what he'd said the night before, "I let them treat you as temporary." And she thought keeping this letter is doing the same thing to him that was done to her family. Deciding what someone else gets to know. Deciding for them. She found him in the library just after breakfast. He was reading, and he looked up when she came in, and she pulled the letter from her pocket and set it on the desk in front of him without speaking. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Read it," she said. He read it slowly. She watched his face while he did. He was very controlled, but she had been watching him long enough now to know the signs, the small tightening at the corner of his eye, the almost imperceptible shift in his breathing. When he finished, he set the letter down. "Aunt Beatrice found this," he said. "3 weeks ago. The parish records your mother's birth entry, she told me." Clara felt something cold move through her. "You knew. I knew your mother was born Ruth Ashford. I didn't know your father knew. I didn't know he'd told you." He looked at her steadily. "I was waiting to see if you'd tell me yourself." "You were testing me." "No." He shook his head, and his voice was very clear. "I was giving you room to choose. There's a difference." He looked down at the letter again. "Blood doesn't frighten me, Clara. Power, inheritance, bloodlines, I've watched all of it poison people my entire life. None of it means anything to me." He looked up. "Lies do. Silence that's meant to manipulate does. But you came to me with the truth, even when it cost you. I sat on it for 5 days. she said honestly. And then you told me. He held her gaze. That's not nothing. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was wound tight. I didn't want you to think I was using it, she said. The connection. I didn't want it to be the reason for anything between us. It isn't, he said simply. It never was. The library went very quiet. Outside, she could hear the horses in the yard, and somewhere down the corridor, Lydia was singing something off-key and cheerful, and the ordinary sounds of the house went on around them while they stood in that quiet and didn't look away from each other. Nathaniel, she said. Clara, he said, and the way he said her name without the miss, just her name, plain and careful and particular, felt like something being decided. She didn't have time to understand what she was about to say next, because the door opened and a farmhand appeared with his hat in his hands and his face set with urgency. Beg your pardon, sir. Ryder just came in from Harker's Mill. Mr. Colton says the Perryman land dispute's gone bad. They're calling for you to come settle it before it goes to violence. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara. I'll be back by Friday, he said. Go, she said. It's fine. He picked up her father's letter from the desk and held it out to her. When she took it, his fingers closed over hers for just a moment, brief, deliberate, unmistakable, and then he let go and turned to follow the farmhand out. Clara stood in the library for a long moment after he left. She thought Friday is 3 days away. She didn't know yet that 3 days was more than enough time for everything to fall apart. Gideon Vale arrived the next afternoon. She didn't know who he was when he rode in. She was crossing the yard when she heard his voice carrying Pleasant on the surface and something else underneath speaking to the housekeeper on the front steps. He was maybe 50, well-dressed, without being elegant, with the kind of easy confidence that belongs to men who've made their money by knowing other people's business before they do. Lydia appeared at Clara's elbow. Go inside, she said, and her voice had lost all its usual brightness. Clara looked at her. Who is he? Gideon Vale. Lydia said the name like it tasted bad. He's a land speculator. He and Nathaniel's father had arrangements that Nathaniel's been trying to untangle for 2 years. She paused. He's not here to be friendly. Clara went inside, but she didn't go far. She was in the sitting room, just off the main hall, close enough to hear, far enough to be unseen, when Vale was shown in and asked to wait. She heard him moving around the hall, and then she heard him stop, and then she heard his voice low and directed, and she realized with a cold clarity that he knew she was there. Miss Whitcomb, he said pleasantly. I believe that's you. Don't trouble yourself to hide. I only want a word. She stepped out. Vale looked her over, the way men look at things they're calculating a price on. Sit down, he said, and there was something in his tone that was almost amused, the ease of a man who's held the winning hand so long he's stopped pretending otherwise. Clara didn't sit. Say what you came to say, Mr. Vale. He smiled. Direct. Nathaniel always did have interesting taste. He clasped his hands behind his back. I'll be plain with you, Miss Whitcomb, because I think you'd find anything else insulting. I know who your father is. I know what the Ashford family did to him. And I know, he paused just long enough, about your mother's birth record. Clara kept her face completely still. I hold debt papers, Vale continued, connected to your father's name. Old ones predating the false accusation, in fact. Perfectly legal. In the right hands, they could ruin what little the Whitcomb family has managed to rebuild. He tilted his head. In the wrong hands, they're simply paper. What do you want? Clara said. I want you to go home, he said simply and pleasantly, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. I want you to go home and stay there and stop being an inconvenient variable in arrangements that were decided long before you wandered in from the marsh. He paused. If you stay close to Nathaniel Ashford, I will tell every family in this county that your people schemed their way into Ashford Ridge, that Elias Whitcomb sent his daughter to trade on a manufactured grudge and a forged bloodline connection, that everything about the Whitcombs has always been calculated. It won't be believed, Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. By some no, Vale agreed. But enough. And Nathaniel's position is not as secure as you might think. There are men on the county board who owe me favors and would welcome a reason to question his judgment. A man who takes a marsh girl into his household and dances with her at assemblies and lets her play at family connections. He spread his hands. It reads poorly, Miss Whitcomb. You know it does. Clara looked at him and felt a very cold, very clear anger settle somewhere behind her sternum. Not the hot kind that makes you say things you'll regret. The other kind. The kind that stays. I won't be threatened out of a house I was invited into, she said. No, Vale said pleasantly. I didn't think you would be. That's why I wanted to explain the alternative clearly. He reached into his coat and placed a folded paper on the hall table. Think it over. You have until Nathaniel returns. He walked out. Clara stood in the hall and looked at the folded paper for a long moment. She didn't touch it. Mrs. Mercer arrived the following morning. Caroline's mother was a softer-looking woman than her daughter, all rounded edges and careful courtesy. The kind of woman who'd spent 40 years being pleasant in rooms where she disagreed with everything. She asked to speak with Clara privately, and when Clara sat down across from her in the yellow sitting room, Mrs. Mercer placed a small envelope on the table between them. I want you to understand, Mrs. Mercer said, that I don't dislike you, Miss Whitcomb. I think you're a remarkable young woman. I truly do. But, Clara said. Mrs. Mercer folded her hands. But there are arrangements that have been years in the making. Caroline and Nathaniel, their families have been aligned since before either of them was old enough to have a say in it. It was what both families intended, what the county intended. She looked at the envelope. I'm not asking you to do anything shameful. I'm asking you to accept what's being offered and go home. Start fresh. You could go anywhere. Clara looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up. How much? She said. Mrs. Mercer blinked. I beg your pardon. How much is in the envelope? A pause. $50. Clara looked at her steadily. Mrs. Mercer, she said, the last time someone put money on a table to make a Whitcomb disappear, it took 15 years and a man's entire life to undo the damage. I will not be the second one. She stood up. Please see yourself out, she said. And tell Caroline I hope she finds someone who actually wants to marry her. That'd be a kinder life for everybody. She walked out before Mrs. Mercer could answer. She went straight to the stable because it was the only place she could breathe properly. And she stood with her hand on Silver Bell's neck and let herself shake for exactly 1 minute before she stopped. She was not going to leave. She was not going to be bought or threatened or politely erased. She was going to wait for Nathaniel to come home, and she was going to tell him everything, and they were going to face it together, whatever it cost. That was the decision she made in the stable, with the mare warm under her hand and the afternoon light pressing in around her. She held it for 18 hours. The letter arrived the second evening. It was addressed to no one specifically left on the hall table by a writer who disappeared before anyone got a clear look at him. The housekeeper brought it to Clara because Clara was the only member of the household currently present with any authority, and because it had the Ashford name written on the outside. Clara opened it. It was written in a hand she didn't recognize, formal, deliberate, and it described in careful and specific detail how Nathaniel Ashford's reputation in the county was collapsing, how 3 members of the board had privately withdrawn their support, how the decision to bring Clara Whitcomb into the household had been the beginning of a series of judgments that men of standing were now questioning, how, if things continued as they were, the Ashford estate's political and financial position would be compromised beyond repair within the season. It said the girl must go or everything your family built will go with her. Clara read it twice. She knew somewhere underneath the cold, sick feeling spreading through her chest, she knew that this was Vale. That this was constructed. That a letter this convenient arriving this precisely was not an accident. She knew that. And she sat with that knowledge, and she pressed it up against the other knowledge that Nathaniel had enemies she didn't fully understand, that his position was genuinely complicated, that she had walked into this house carrying a history that had already cost one generation everything it had, and she felt the two things press against each other like stones, and she could not find the clean answer in the space between them. She thought, what if I'm wrong, and it's real? She thought, what if staying destroys him? She thought about her father's face the morning she'd left home. Be careful with what you hear up there, Clara. She folded the letter. She went upstairs, and she packed her bag with the same quiet, efficient hands that had walked a wounded horse 3 miles without asking for anything in return. She left a note for Lydia, short, careful, full of things she meant, but couldn't fully explain. She left a note for Aunt Beatrice that was even shorter. She left nothing for Nathaniel, because she didn't know how to write down, I am leaving to give you back a life. I'm afraid I'm costing you, in a way that didn't sound like she was asking him to talk her out of it. And she was too proud to ask him that. The hired wagon came before dawn. She was at the gate with her bag before the driver had fully stopped, and she climbed up herself without help. And she looked back at the house once, at the dark windows and the shape of it against the lightening sky. And she thought about Silver Bell in the stable, about Lydia's laugh, about a library at night, and a man who said her name like it was something he'd been waiting to say. Then she looked forward. The wagon moved. Nathaniel came home on Friday. He came home to 2 letters on the hall table and a household that felt wrong the way a room feels wrong when something has been removed from it. The first letter was the forged one. He read it standing in the hall with his coat still on, and his expression went flat and still the way it did when he was angrier than he intended to show. The second letter was real. He knew before he opened it, because the handwriting on the outside was Aunt Beatrice's, and Aunt Beatrice only wrote in full when something had gone wrong enough to require documentation. She left the letter said, Vale was here. Mrs. Mercer was here. The forged letter arrived the second night. She believed it enough to act on it, or she chose to believe it, I cannot say which. I suspect she left to protect you. I suspect she will not come back unless you go to her. And I suspect, Nathaniel, that you understand what that means. He stood in the hall for a long time. Then he called for his horse. It had begun to rain. He rode anyway. The rain had stopped by the time Nathaniel reached the Whitcomb farm, but the ground was still soft, and his horse's hooves made no sound on the wet grass, and the gate stood open like it always did, like the family had never quite gotten into the habit of closing things off from the world. He didn't knock. He walked around to the side of the house because the kitchen light was on and the front room was dark, and as he came around the corner, he saw the orchard beyond the kitchen garden, the low, crooked apple trees his father had once passed by without looking at, because men like Charles Ashford did not look at things that didn't belong to them and didn't cost anything. Clara was standing among them. She was wearing the plain gray dress she'd had on the first morning he'd seen her before Ashford Ridge, before assemblies and drawing rooms and all the rest of it. Her hair was loose. She was standing very still with her arms at her sides, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, except that it was the most honest face he'd ever seen on another person. He stopped a few feet away. She spoke first. You shouldn't have ridden in the rain, she said. The road past Mercer's mill floods. I know, he said. Then why? Because you left, he said. And then because that wasn't quite enough. Because you left and you didn't tell me, and I came home to a forged letter and a house that felt like the wrong answer to a question I was still asking. Clara looked at him. Her jaw was set in that particular way. Not stubborn exactly. Braced. Like she was prepared to receive something she didn't want to. I read the letter, she said quietly. The one about your position on the board. About the men withdrawing their support. She paused. I know it was Vale. I knew it probably before I finished reading it, but I couldn't. She stopped. She pressed her mouth flat. I couldn't be certain enough to stake your entire future on my certainty. So you left. So I left. He looked at her for a long moment. Do you know what Aunt Beatrice's letter said? No. She said she suspected you left to protect me. He took one step closer. Were you? Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the ground between them, and he watched her fight with some habit of self-sufficiency that had kept her alive in hard conditions for a long time, and didn't know how to stand down, even when standing down was the right thing. "Yes," she said finally. "I was. Clara." His voice came out lower than he intended. "Look at me." She looked up. "There is no clean life for me without the truth," he said. "I have spent 2 years trying to repair what my father did to your family, to this county, to the people who trusted the Ashford name, and got burned for it. And the whole time I was doing that, I was doing it alone because I thought that was what restitution looked like. I thought you paid debts by yourself in private where nobody had to watch." He paused. "And then you walked into my stable, and wrapped my mother's horse's leg with yarrow tincture, and talked to her like she was worth talking to. And I started to understand that I had been doing it wrong." Clara was very still. "You are the truth," he said. "Not the blood connection, I don't care about that. Not the horse, not the restitution, none of it. You. The way you move through a room like you belong in it, and you're not going to apologize for that. The way you told Aunt Beatrice she'd already made up her mind before she asked you a single question. The way you sat with my sister and made her feel like a person instead of a problem to be managed." He exhaled. "Every single time you had a chance to profit from this situation, to use the bloodline, to use the horse, to use my guilt, you chose something else. Every time." Her eyes had gone bright. She didn't look away. "I love you," he said. "I want to be plain about that, because I have not been plain about it, and I should have been sooner." The orchard was completely quiet. Then Clara said, "I knew it was Vale," and something cracked in her voice that she immediately controlled. "I sat with that letter for 2 hours. I knew, and I left anyway, because I kept thinking, what if the one time I trust my own judgment is the one time I'm wrong? What if staying cost you everything you've spent 2 years trying to fix?" "It wouldn't have," he said. "I know that now." She pressed one hand flat against her sternum like she was holding something in. "I love you too. I want to say it plainly because you said it plainly, and you deserve the same." She met his eyes. "I love you, and I left because of it, and that was wrong, and I'm sorry." He crossed the distance between them, and took both her hands in his, and she let him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because some things sit better in silence than in words. Then he said, "Come home." "Ashford Ridge isn't my home," she said. "It will be," he said, "if you want it." She looked at their hands. His were still cold from the ride. Hers were warm. "First we deal with Vale," she said. "Yes. All of it. The forged letter. The debt papers on my father. The ledger evidence about the false accusation. All of it comes out." "All of it," he agreed. "And I want to be standing next to you when it does," she said. "Not waiting at home, not protected from it. Next to you." He looked at her steadily. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Nathaniel and then at his daughter's hands in Nathaniel's hands, and then at Nathaniel's face, and something moved across his own expression that was too complicated to be just one thing. Relief and grief, and something that might have been a very old anger, finally putting itself down. "You rode in the rain," he said to Nathaniel. "Yes, sir." "Could have waited until morning." "No, sir," Nathaniel said quietly. "I couldn't." Elias looked at him for another long moment. Then he pushed the kitchen door open wider. "You'd better come inside," he said, and it was the same words he'd used the first night, but they sounded different now. Less like bracing for weather, more like opening a window. Ruth was at the table. She stood when Nathaniel came in, and she looked at him with the particular careful stillness of a woman who has been waiting for a confrontation for 15 years and is not entirely sure what shape it will take now that it's here. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Nathaniel said. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at her directly. "I know who you are. I know what the Ashford family did to you before you were old enough to choose anything for yourself. I know they decided you were inconvenient and made you invisible, and I know you spent your whole life making yourself into something real, without any help from a family that owed you considerably more." He paused. I can't undo that. I can't make it right in the way it deserves to be made right. But I want you to know that I know it, and I am sorry." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Sit down, Mr. Ashford. I'll make coffee." Clara caught her father's eye across the room. He gave her the smallest nod she'd ever seen, barely a movement at all. It was enough. "'Kay." They rode back to Ashford Ridge together at first light. Sam, who had appeared from the barn at some point in the night and refused to go back to bed, watched them go from the gate with an expression of profound satisfaction that he was far too young to have earned. "Don't make that face," Clara called back to him. "I'm not making a face," Sam called. "This is just what my face looks like." Nathaniel glanced over at her as they rode. "Your brother," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry in advance." The corner of his mouth moved. "I like him." "Everyone likes him. That's the problem." Aunt Beatrice was standing in the front hall when they arrived, dressed sharp-eyed, holding a leather folio against her chest, like a woman who has been waiting to deploy information and has been waiting with considerable patience. She looked at Clara. She looked at Nathaniel. She looked at them standing side by side with the mourning still on their clothes. "You went to her," she said to Nathaniel. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Good." She turned and walked toward the study. "Come." They followed. She set the folio on the desk and opened it. Inside were documents, old ones, the paper gone soft at the edges, with years of careful storage. The estate ledgers from 1799, the private accounts beside them. The discrepancy laid out in Beatrice's own hand on a fresh sheet of paper, annotated and dated. "I had copies made," she said crisply. "Certified copies properly witnessed. Gideon Vale holds debt papers on the Whitcomb name that were issued against a man who was publicly branded a thief. If that branding is publicly overturned, and it will be those papers become legally questionable. A man cannot collect a debt incurred under fraudulent social conditions." She looked at Clara. "Your father will need to agree to a public statement. The county board convenes in 12 days. Clara looked at the documents. "What about the forged letter?" Beatrice's expression was the precise kind of satisfied that comes from having anticipated a question and prepared the answer 3 days earlier. "I kept the original. Vale is not a careful man. He used his own seal on the wax. Faint but identifiable." She paused. "He assumed you were too frightened to look closely." "He was wrong," Clara said. "Evidently." Beatrice closed the folio. She looked at Clara for a moment with the particular expression that had made Clara's knees uncertain the first night at supper, and then she said, "You came back." "Yes, ma'am." "I didn't think you would." A pause. "I am glad to have been wrong." For Beatrice Ashford, that was an embrace. Lydia found out within the hour and was so exuberantly relieved that she had to be gently removed from the study so the adults could finish talking. "I knew it," she said, stopping in the corridor and turning to face Clara with both hands pressed against her own face. "I knew it from the second week. You kept finding reasons to be in the same room as him and calling it coincidence." "I was visiting the horse," Clara said. "The horse," Lydia repeated with tremendous feeling. "Lydia, the horse was in the stable, and somehow you ended up in the library at 9 o'clock at night. I needed a book." Lydia grabbed both of Clara's hands and squeezed them hard. "Please stay," she said, and the brightness dropped out of her voice entirely for just a moment, leaving something younger and more honest underneath it. "Please, I know there's still everything to work out, but please just stay." Clara looked at her. "I'm staying," she said. "I promised I would." Lydia exhaled. Then she pulled Clara into a hug so sudden and forceful that Clara nearly lost her balance. "Don't ever leave like that again," Lydia said into her shoulder. I cried. "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it. "You should be." Lydia pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand with absolutely no self-consciousness. Nathaniel was impossible. He didn't say anything, but he looked like a man who'd swallowed a stone and was waiting to see if it would come back up. Lydia, I'm just telling you the facts. Gideon Vale was not a man who went down quietly. He came to Ashford Ridge 3 days before the board convening, which Clara thought was either very bold or very stupid, and she had decided by the end of his first sentence that it was both. Nathaniel received him in the front hall. Clara stood 2 steps behind and to his left. Beatrice stood to his right with the folio. Vale looked at the 3 of them and understood immediately that this was not the meeting he had prepared for. "Mr. Ashford," he said, and the pleasantness was still there, but it was working harder than before. "I heard you'd come home. I wanted to speak with you before the board convening. There are some matters regarding the Harker's Mill property that—" "We'll discuss Harker's Mill another time," Nathaniel said. "We'll discuss the debt papers on the Whitcomb name first." Vale's eyes moved to Clara. Something shifted in them, not fear exactly. "Recalculation. That's a private financial matter," he said. "It was," Nathaniel said. "It won't be after Tuesday." He nodded to Beatrice. Beatrice opened the folio and removed the certified copy of the 1799 ledger evidence. She held it out toward Vale without expression. Vale looked at it without taking it. "Where did you get that?" "My brother kept better records than your father assumed," Beatrice said. "Charles was meticulous about his private accounts. He simply expected that no one who mattered would ever look." Vale's jaw tightened. "That document doesn't change the legal standing of the debt." "The forged letter does," Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back. "You used your own seal," she said. "Faint but there. You assumed I was too rattled to notice details. I noticed." She paused. "My father was a head clerk. I grew up checking documents for discrepancies. It's something you learn young in a family that can't afford mistakes." The hall was very quiet. Vale looked at Nathaniel. "You're making an enemy of someone who has connections on that board." 3 men, Nathaniel said. "I know which 3. I've spoken to 2 of them already. The 3rd I'll speak to before Tuesday." He held Vale's gaze without heat, without performance, without anything except the absolute steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is not going to be moved from it. "You are welcome to contest this at the convening if you choose. That is your legal right. But I want to be clear about what will happen if you do. Every document in that folio goes into the public record. Your methods become a matter of county record, and I will personally spend the following year making sure that every family in this valley understands what you did to a man you had no grievance with for no reason except that he was convenient." Vale stood very still. "Or," Nathaniel continued, "you surrender the Whitcomb debt papers today, and we proceed to Tuesday's convening with the ledger evidence only, which is about my father, not about you." Another silence. Vale looked at Clara one more time. She thought he was going to say something cutting. Men like him usually needed the last word. But he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there, it made him think better of it. He reached inside his coat and placed a folded document on the hall table. "Good day, Mr. Ashford," he said, and walked out. Clara let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 4 days. "That's it," Lydia said from the top of the stairs where she had been completely and unsuccessfully pretending not to listen. "That's not it," Beatrice said, picking up the debt papers without looking up. "That's the beginning of the end of it. There is a difference." The county board convening on Tuesday was the kind of event that people talk about for years afterward, not because anything dramatic happened in the meeting room itself, but because of what was said outside it in the corridors, and on the steps, and in the carriages going home, and the way it moved through the county, like water finding its own level. Elias Whitcomb stood before the board with Nathaniel beside him, and stated his case plainly and without emotion. He did not perform suffering. He did not ask for pity. He presented facts in the careful, organized language of a man who had once been very good at his work, and had never quite stopped being that even when the world had told him his work no longer mattered. The ledger evidence was entered into the record. The false accusation of 1799 was formally overturned. Elias Whitcomb's name was cleared. Clara sat in the gallery with Ruth on one side and Lydia on the other, and she watched her father stand in that room and reclaim something that had been taken from him before she was old enough to know it was gone. Ruth made no sound, but her hand found Clara's and held it with a grip that said everything she wasn't able to say out loud. Caroline Mercer's father abstained from the vote, which was its own kind of statement, and the three men Vale had counted on split 2-1 in favor of the resolution. Vale himself did not appear. It was over in 40 minutes. Nathaniel proposed in the orchard. Not because he had planned it for the orchard specifically. He had planned it for considerably more formal circumstances, had in fact spent 2 days thinking about the right moment with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything. But Clara had gone out to the orchard after supper because it was the place she always went when she needed to think. And he had followed her because he was past pretending he didn't want to be wherever she was. He asked her to marry him plainly. No speech, no performance. Just her name and a question and the look on his face that she had come to recognize as the most honest version of him, the version that existed before the militia officer and the estate heir. And 15 years of carrying his father's guilt had stacked themselves up on top of whatever he'd originally been. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Not today," she said. He didn't flinch. "All right, I want to come to you without any fear left hidden between us," she said. "I want to stand in front of whoever we have to stand in front of and know that there's nothing underneath it that we haven't already said out loud." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying soon, when it's clean all the way through." He looked at her. He nodded once. "I can wait," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's one of the reasons." He put his hand out, palm up, and she put hers in it, and they stood in the orchard in the evening light with the apple trees around them and the farm road beyond the fence and everything they'd both come through still settling into its right shape around them. He didn't ask again that night, but when she turned to go back inside, he said, "Clara?" She looked back. "I would have waited," he said, "from the very beginning, whatever you needed. I want you to know that." She looked at him, this man who had ridden through rain, who had put the truth of his father's sins into the public record without hesitation, who had stood next to her father in a county boardroom, like it was simply the correct thing to do, which it was. "I know," she said, and she went inside, and he stood in the orchard alone for a few minutes, and the evening settled around him, and for the first time, in a very long time, Nathaniel Ashford felt something loosen in his chest that he had stopped noticing was tight. The engagement was announced on a Wednesday morning in October, and by Wednesday afternoon, every family within 20 miles knew about it. And by Thursday, the county had divided itself, as it always did about things that mattered, into 2 camps. The first camp said it was inappropriate, unwise, and a sign that Nathaniel Ashford had lost either his judgment or his mind, possibly both, somewhere between the militia and the marsh road. The second camp said nothing publicly, but watched very carefully the way people watch when they suspect they're about to be proven wrong about something and aren't entirely sorry about it. Clara heard about both camps from Lydia, who reported on county opinion with the thoroughness of a general tracking troop movements, and absolutely none of the anxiety that the information was apparently designed to cause. "The Hendersons think you've bewitched him," Lydia said one morning, sitting cross-legged on Clara's bed, while Clara pinned her hair. Mrs. Henderson specifically used the word scheme. "Mrs. Henderson uses that word about everything she doesn't understand," Clara said. "True, she used it about my mother's herb garden once." Lydia tilted her head. "Are you worried?" Clara looked at herself in the mirror. She thought about the question honestly, the way she did all questions. "No," she said. "I spent a long time being worried about what this county thought. It cost me a lot of energy and it didn't change anything." She set down the pen. "People will think what they think. The only thing I can do is be what I am and let that be enough." Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, when Nathaniel first told me he was going to the Whitcomb farm that night after you left, I asked him if he was sure, If he'd thought it through. All the complications. She paused. He said, I've thought about what it looks like without her, and that's worse than any complication. And then he rode out in the rain. Clara looked at Lydia in the mirror. I'm telling you that, Lydia said, because I think you should know. Not because you need convincing. Because you deserve to know that someone chose you that clearly that fast and that it wasn't complicated for him at all. Clara pressed her mouth together for a moment, took a breath. Thank you, she said. Don't cry, Lydia said. You'll have to redo your hair. Aunt Beatrice called Clara into the study 3 weeks after the engagement announcement. Clara had learned to read Beatrice's summons the way you learn to read weather, by the small signs, the particular quality of the message, the time of day. A morning summons meant information. An evening summons meant evaluation. This one came mid-afternoon, which she didn't have a category for yet. Beatrice was standing at the window when Clara came in. She didn't turn around immediately, which meant she was organizing something in herself before she spoke. Clara sat down and waited. I owe you an accounting, Beatrice said finally. Ma'am? Beatrice turned. She was holding a small envelope, and she set it on the desk between them. This is from my private correspondence, written 6 weeks before you arrived here, before the horse, before any of it. She pushed the envelope toward Clara. Open it. Clara opened it. It was a letter addressed to a solicitor in Richmond, inquiring into the status of the Whitcomb family. The inquiry was thorough: Elias's history, the false accusation, his current financial position. Ruth Ashford Whitcomb's birth record, the whereabouts and character of the children. Clara looked up. You were already investigating us. I was investigating the loose ends of Charles Ashford's estate, Beatrice said. When Nathaniel found the ledger evidence, he told me, and I... She paused, which was unusual for her. I decided to look into what had become of the family. Before I told Nathaniel what I'd found. Before I advised him on how to proceed. Why? Because I wanted to know what I was recommending he walk toward, Beatrice said. I wanted to know if the Whitcombs were worth the complication. Clara held her gaze, and I concluded they were. Beatrice sat down across from her. I also concluded that if Nathaniel went to that farmhouse, something would happen that I could not predict and could not control. And I went ahead and told him anyway, because... She paused again. Because I have spent 40 years watching Ashford men choose the safe thing, the expected thing, the thing that looked right in drawing rooms, and I was tired of it. I wanted to see what happened when one of them chose correctly instead. The study was very quiet. You could have told me this sooner, Clara said. I could have. Beatrice agreed. I chose not to because I wanted to watch you earn it, to be sure. She looked at Clara directly. I am sure. For Beatrice Ashford, that was the closest thing to a blessing Clara was ever going to get. She understood that. She accepted it. Thank you, ma'am, she said. Beatrice waved a hand. Don't be sentimental about it. There's still the matter of the spring calendar, and what to do about the Henderson family's continued rudeness, and I will need your opinion on both. Clara almost smiled. I'll need coffee first. Obviously, Beatrice said, and stood to ring the bell. Biag. She said yes in November, not because the fear was entirely gone. She had told him she wanted it gone, and she'd meant it, but she was honest enough with herself to know that some fears don't fully leave. They just lose their power to stop you. She said yes because she woke up one morning and looked at the ceiling of her room at Ashford Ridge, her room that had been hers for months now, that smelled like the yarrow sachets she'd hung in the wardrobe, and thought, I am not afraid of this anymore. I am ready for it. She went and found him in the library. He was reading. He looked up when she came in and waited because he had learned to read her the way she'd learned to read weather, and he could see something was settled in her face that hadn't been settled the last time. She said, I'm ready. He set the book down. Ready for what, specifically? Nathaniel. Clara? You know what I mean. He stood up. He crossed the room and took her hands and held them the same way he had in the orchard, warm, steady, without making a production of it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. He brought her hands up and held them against his chest for a moment, with his eyes closed, and Clara watched his face and thought, "This is what it looks like when a person puts something down that they've been carrying for a very long time." Then he looked at her and said, "Spring." "Spring," she agreed.
Jaw check.
They married in April at Ashford Ridge on a Saturday with good weather and the apple trees in the orchard just beginning to open. The wedding was not the grandest event the county had ever seen, because neither of them wanted that. And Beatrice, who had strong opinions about every other aspect of the planning, concurred that a ceremony designed to impress people who had doubted them was not worth the effort. What it was real. Elias Whitcomb walked his daughter down the aisle of the small chapel on the estate grounds, with his shoulders straight and his head up, and the particular dignity of a man who has had his name returned to him and has decided quietly and permanently never to let it be taken again. He shook Nathaniel's hand before he stepped back, and the handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually do. Ruth wore blue, a color she'd put away years ago, and had started wearing again in small ways since October, as if she was testing herself, making sure the world would hold. She wore it fully now, and it suited her, and she cried at the ceremony with the unself-conscious openness of a woman who has earned every tear. Sam, now 15, and possessed of an opinion on everything, served as groomsman, and behaved almost perfectly, which Clara counted as a full success. Lydia stood beside Clara and held her flowers and cried harder than anyone, which she would later deny entirely. Beatrice did not cry, but she sat in the front row with her hands folded and her posture immaculate. And when Clara said her vows plain and clear, and without a tremor, Beatrice gave the smallest single nod, like someone marking a thing done correctly. After the ceremony, when the guests had moved to the yard for the celebration, Nathaniel found Clara standing briefly alone near the orchard gate. He came up beside her, and she leaned into him just slightly, and they stood there for a moment, looking at the apple trees. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it genuinely. "Like myself," she said. "Exactly like myself. Just more settled." He put his arm around her. "That's a good answer." "I thought so," she said, and she felt him laugh, quiet and real, the kind of laugh that lives in the chest, rather than the throat, and she thought, there it is. There's the thing I came here for, without knowing I was coming for it. Not the house, not the name, not any of it. Just this. The county adjusted. Not all at once, and not without friction, and not without the particular social grumbling that accompanies any situation in which people are forced to revise opinions they've held in public. But it adjusted. It always does when someone stands still long enough and steady enough, and the story they're telling turns out to be true. The Hendersons were cool for several months, and then warmer after Clara quietly helped their youngest daughter's horse through a difficult illness without being asked, and without mentioning it to anyone afterward. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it to everyone. That was its own kind of resolution. 3 other families, smaller, less prominent, with the kind of honest, practical needs that don't get discussed in drawing rooms, came to Clara directly in the months following the wedding. A horse with a broken spirit, a mule that wouldn't work, a farm dog that wasn't right after a bad winter. She helped all of them. She didn't charge money she knew they didn't have. She charged what they could give, which was sometimes labor, and sometimes produce, and sometimes nothing at all, and she wrote none of it down as a debt. Nathaniel watched this happen and said nothing about it, because he understood that this was not a thing to comment on or manage or make decisions about. This was Clara being what she'd always been. He was simply in the fortunate position of being close enough to watch it. By summer, she had begun something that nobody had a formal name for. Yet she opened the Ashford stables 2 mornings a week to the local farming families who couldn't afford proper horse care. Not charity, not a service, just come, and I will show you. She taught the children first, because children learn without their pride getting in the way, and the children taught their parents, and slowly the stable on those mornings became a place where the distinction between who owned the land and who worked it seemed for a few hours less important than whether the horse was standing right. Nathaniel hired 3 additional stable hands to manage the increase. He didn't announce it. He just did it. When Clara noticed, she looked at him across the yard, and he shrugged in a way that meant of course. That was how they operated. Quietly. Effectively. Without making speeches about it. Elias took a position as land records clerk for the county office in the fall, a position that had been quietly arranged by Nathaniel through a board member who owed him, and which Elias accepted without asking too many questions about how it had materialized, because he was practical enough to understand that sometimes restitution looks like an open door, and the only correct response is to walk through it. He was good at the work. He had always been good at it. He moved through the county records with the systematic precision of a man who'd spent 15 years mentally maintaining an office that no longer existed, and within 6 months, he was the person that 3 other clerks came to when something didn't add up. Ruth started a kitchen garden at the Whitcomb farmhouse, a serious one. The kind she hadn't bothered with in years, because the energy of hope takes a particular kind of stability to sustain. She grew yarrow, of course, and marshwort, and a dozen other things, and she sent bundles of it to Ashford Ridge with the weekly wagon, so Clara would always have what she needed for the stable work. Clara used every bundle and sent back preserves and sometimes letters that were longer than letters strictly needed to be, because some distances are best kept short by filling them with words. Sam was sent to school in Richmond in September. He wrote home irregularly and at length, and his letters were full of opinions about everything he was learning and questions about Silverbell's recovery, which by then was long since complete, and observations about city life that made Clara laugh, and Elias shake his head in the particular way that fathers shake their heads at sons who are despite everything exactly what they'd hoped for. The twist nobody had expected came in October, almost exactly a year after the engagement announcement. A rider came to Ashford Ridge with a letter addressed to Nathaniel, official correspondence, sealed with the county court's mark, and Nathaniel opened it in the study with Clara beside him and read it twice before he set it down. "Vale is contesting the board resolution," he said. Clara looked at the letter. "On what grounds?" "He's found a solicitor in Richmond who's arguing that the 1799 ledger evidence is inadmissible because the original document wasn't produced at the convening, only the certified copy." "That's—" Clara stopped. She picked up the letter and read it herself. "That's not nothing," she said quietly. "If the court agrees that the certified copy is insufficient, then the resolution can be revisited," Nathaniel said. "Yes." They looked at each other. "How long has he been building this?" Clara said. "The letter is dated August," Nathaniel said. "He's been building it since the day he walked out of this house." The study was very quiet. "All right," Clara said. "All right." Nathaniel looked at her. "We go back to the beginning." She set the letter down. "The original ledger, where is it? The estate archive, bottom of the south cabinet. I pulled the certified copy from it last year and put it back." "Then we have the original," she said. "We always had the original. He's built an argument against something that was never the whole of our evidence." She looked at Nathaniel steadily. "He thought we'd be rattled. He thought a year of quiet would make us careless." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. That particular quality she'd come to recognize as the version of him that was both absolutely certain and trying not to show how much it mattered. "You're not rattled," he said. "No," she said. "I've been through worse than a legal letter from a man who uses his own seal on forged documents." She pushed back from the desk. "Get Beatrice. Get the archive key. We'll have everything the court needs by the end of the week." Beatrice, when informed, looked almost satisfied. "I kept a full chain of custody on the original document," she said. "Witnessed, dated, and stored under lock. I assumed we would need it eventually. Vale is not the first man who thought delay was a strategy." "Was there ever a moment," Clara said, "when you weren't 3 steps ahead of everyone in this county?" Beatrice considered this. 1987, she said. "I was briefly outmaneuvered by a particularly clever farrier." She paused. "It will not happen again." The court hearing was requested. The original ledger was produced. The chain of custody was presented. The Richmond solicitor, faced with documentation more thorough than he had prepared for, withdrew the challenge within the week. Vale's attempt collapsed before it reached the judge's desk. This time there was no public announcement, no board convening, no ceremony. Nathaniel found Clara in the stable that evening, with Silver Bell naturally where she often was in the late afternoon, and he stood in the doorway and said, "It's done, for good this time." Clara ran her hand along the mare's neck. "I know," she said. "Beatrice sent word an hour ago." He came to stand beside her. "You knew before I told you, and you didn't say anything." "I was waiting to hear what your face did when you told me," she said. "It's easier to see when you think I don't already know." He looked at her. "What did my face do?" "Something it doesn't do very often," she said. It relaxed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's really over." "Yes," she said. "It is." Silver Bell pressed her nose against Clara's shoulder, which she did when she wanted attention, and Clara scratched behind the mare's ear and said, I know," in that low, easy voice that had always worked better than silence. Nathaniel watched her. "She trusts you more than she trusts anyone," he said, "including me." "She trusted me first," Clara said simply. "That's all." He looked at the horse, and then at his wife, and something moved across his face that was too quiet and too full to name the look of a man who has come a very long way from where he started, and is only now, in this ordinary moment, fully understanding the distance. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." "In a minute," she said. "She's not finished." He leaned against the stable door and waited, because that was what you did with Clara. You waited, and the waiting was always worth it. Fatigue. By the following spring, people across the county had begun calling her by a name she hadn't given herself. It started with the farmers' practical people, who named things by what they did, and it spread the way. Useful things spread person to person without ceremony or announcement. When a horse wouldn't eat, when a mule turned mean from bad handling, when someone's working animal was so close to useless that the family couldn't afford to replace it and couldn't afford to keep it, they sent for Clara Whitcomb. Not Mrs. Ashford, not the mistress of the estate. Clara Whitcomb, the way they'd always said it, because that was the name attached to the hands that helped, and the voice that steadied, and the knowledge passed down through a mother's kitchen and a father's careful example. And everything a poor girl learns when she grows up, understanding that mercy is not a luxury. It is the one thing you can give that costs you something real. She never turned anyone away. She didn't distinguish between the families who had doubted her and the ones who hadn't. She showed up the same way she'd shown up at everything, with her basket, and her steady voice, and her absolute refusal to make anyone feel small for needing help. Nathaniel, for his part, became someone slightly different than he'd been. Not unrecognizable, still deliberate, still careful, still. The man who carried responsibility like it was weight he'd agreed to and intended to bear properly. But softer at the edges, quicker to laugh, more willing to sit in the kitchen with Elias on Sunday evenings and talk about nothing in particular, which was not something he had ever been able to do before. Clara taught him by example that the nothing in particular conversations were often the most important ones. He laughed more. He listened better. He repaired what the Ashford name had damaged, not all of it, because some damage doesn't fully repair, but as much as a man could repair in a lifetime if he worked at it honestly and without looking for credit. That was enough. It was more than enough. And Clara, who had walked into the fog one summer morning to gather herbs for her mother, and come home with a wounded horse and a future she hadn't imagined, yet never stopped being exactly who she had been on that road. She asked who was suffering. She helped. She moved on to the next thing. She did it so consistently and so quietly that people stopped noticing it was remarkable and simply counted on it the way you count on water to run downhill and the sun to come up. Not because it's guaranteed, but because it has always been true, and some truths become the ground under your feet. Some said Clara Whitcomb rose because a rich man loved her. They were wrong. She rose because when power wandered wounded into the fog, bleeding frightened worth more than she would ever ask for, she did not stop to calculate the cost. She put her hand against its neck. She spoke in a steady voice. She brought it home. That was the beginning of everything. And it was also in the way of all true things, the whole of it.